What if the most important thing a young person carried out of school was not simply a diploma, but the ability to produce something his country actually needs? That question is becoming increasingly important in Burkina Faso. The country has a young population, agricultural land, livestock, minerals, and enormous human potential. Yet, possessing resources is not the same as possessing the skills required to transform those resources into food, machinery, businesses, jobs, and lasting prosperity. Under Captain Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is attempting an ambitious shift in education. Today, only a small share of students are enrolled in technical and vocational education. The long-term ambition is dramatically different. By 2050, the government wants roughly 60% of learners to move through technical and vocational pathways. But this should not be understood as an attempt to turn 60% of young people into manual laborers or to suggest that universities no longer matter. The larger idea is to build a much broader productive generation, including skilled farmers, craftsmen, technicians, machine operators, entrepreneurs, and engineers. Agriculture may offer the clearest example. Imagine a young man growing up in a region where his family has cultivated crops for generations. The old educational model might teach him academic subjects while leaving the practical knowledge of farming almost entirely outside the classroom. The emerging model asks a different question. Could school teach him how to improve production, operate equipment, raise livestock, preserve crops, process agricultural products, and eventually create greater value from what his community already produces? That is where education begins to connect with economic sovereignty. Traore has become closely associated with the idea that young Burkinabés should leave education capable of doing something practical with their knowledge. But whether that vision succeeds will depend on much more than speeches or new school buildings. It will depend on teachers, equipment, businesses, factories, investment, security, and ultimately jobs. So stay with us, because this story is not simply about classrooms. It is about what happens when the classroom meets the farm, the workshop, and the factory, and whether that connection can help Burkina Faso build a new productive generation from within. To understand the scale of Burkina Faso's ambition, consider the starting point. Only about 5% of students in post-primary and secondary education are currently enrolled in technical and vocational pathways. Yet the country needs skilled technicians, craftsmen, agricultural workers, entrepreneurs, and specialists capable of supporting a productive economy. The government wants to change that balance dramatically. Its long-term objective is to raise the share of learners in technical and vocational education to roughly 60% by 2050. That number deserves attention, but also caution. 60% is a target for the future, not an achievement Burkina Faso can claim today. Reaching it would require decades of investment in schools, teachers, equipment, businesses, and employment opportunities. One of the first major steps is already taking shape. For 2026, the government announced plans to convert 170 general education establishments into multipurpose schools distributed across the country. These schools are intended to introduce different forms of vocational training alongside broader education. This matters because the reform does not have to force families into a forced choice between knowledge and practical skills. A young person should not necessarily have to choose between leaving school with a diploma or leaving school with a trade. The more interesting possibility is that he can possess both. Think about what that could mean for a family. A son might complete his general education while also learning electrical work, mechanics, construction, agriculture, or another practical skill. If university remains his goal, that path can remain open. But if circumstances require him to enter the workforce, help a family business, or create an activity of his own, he would already possess useful capabilities. This is where the educational philosophy associated with Ibrahim Traore becomes important. The value of schooling is being connected more directly to what young people can contribute to the economy after they leave the classroom. But changing percentages on a government plan is much easier than changing an entire educational culture. And if Burkina Faso wants to prove that this approach can work, perhaps no sector offers a more important testing ground than agriculture, where millions of livelihoods and the country's ambition for greater economic self-reliance can meet. Agriculture may be where Burkina Faso's educational experiment becomes easiest to see with your own eyes. At a vocational agricultural school in Yako, the idea of learning is meant to extend beyond notebooks and examinations into fields, livestock areas, and practical production. Students can encounter activities connected with crop production, livestock, forestry, vegetable growing, poultry, and other agricultural work. Crops such as corn, onions, and vegetables are no longer simply subjects that can be discussed in a classroom. They become part of the learning process itself. That distinction matters. A student can memorize how crops grow and still leave school unable to manage a field. Practical training asks him to understand the soil, recognize problems, work with equipment, care for animals, organize production, and eventually turn what he produces into income. There is also a larger effect that is easy to overlook. Imagine a student returning home to a family that has farmed in much the same way for decades. What he learns at school does not necessarily remain with him. New techniques can reach his parents, relatives, and neighbors. In that sense, knowledge can travel from the school to the student to the family, and from the family into the surrounding community. Some agricultural production connected with training can also be sold, giving practical work an economic dimension rather than treating it merely as an exercise. Bayako also reveals why this transformation will be difficult. Practical agricultural education requires more than a rewritten curriculum. Schools need land, water, equipment, machinery, qualified instructors, materials, and maintenance. Earlier reporting around the Yako model pointed to shortages involving equipment such as tractors and specialized personnel. That is an important warning. A government can announce practical education, but without the tools needed to practice, students can quickly find themselves studying practical work theoretically. And even successful farming is only the beginning. If Burkina Faso produces more corn, tomatoes, livestock, and other agricultural goods, but continues to capture too little value after harvest, the economic transformation remains incomplete. The next classroom, therefore, may not be a classroom at all. It may be the processing workshop and the factory, where agricultural production becomes higher value products and where an entirely new range of skilled jobs begins. Producing more food is important, but production alone does not determine how much value remains inside Burkina Faso. The larger economic opportunity begins when crops and livestock are preserved, processed, packaged, and transformed into products that people and businesses are willing to buy. Consider corn. A farmer can harvest corn and sell it as a raw commodity. But the same crop can move through cleaning, storage, milling, processing, packaging, animal feed production, and distribution. Every additional step requires skills, equipment, workers, and businesses. And every step creates another opportunity to keep economic activity inside the country. Burkina Faso is beginning to organize vocational training around this larger chain. A national classification covering agriculture, livestock, and fisheries identifies 348 specific occupations. Remarkably, 105 are connected to processing and preservation. That tells us something important. Modern agricultural education cannot be limited to teaching young people how to farm. A productive agricultural economy also needs machine operators, maintenance technicians, food processors, storage specialists, quality workers, mechanics, managers, and entrepreneurs. Industrial projects offer a glimpse of where these skills might eventually be used. In Dedougou, 2 agricultural processing units were inaugurated with the capacity to process significant quantities of corn, other grains, and sesame. Burkina Faso has also developed tomato processing capacity in places including Bobo, Dioulasso, and Yako. These projects matter because a tomato process inside Burkina Faso represents a different economic story from a tomato exported or sold with little transformation. The same principle applies to corn, sesame, livestock, and many other local resources. This is where the education reform begins to connect with economic sovereignty. Schools can prepare young people to produce. Vocational centers can teach them to operate and maintain equipment. Processing facilities can transform local harvests into higher value goods. Businesses can then distribute those products and create employment around them. None of this guarantees success. A factory needs reliable supplies, electricity, capital, maintenance, customers, and competent management. But the direction is becoming clearer. The real ambition is not simply to grow more. It is to develop the human capacity to capture more value after the harvest. And for that chain to work, Burkina Faso must bring another institution much closer to the classroom: the private enterprise. Can someone truly learn to operate industrial machinery by reading about it in a classroom? That question explains why Burkina Faso is trying to bring schools and businesses much closer together. At a national forum on technical and vocational education, officials announced a platform presenting more than 2,000 internship opportunities. Companies were encouraged to participate regularly so that students could spend time inside real workplaces and gain practical experience before completing their education. The logic is straightforward. A classroom can explain how a machine works. A workshop teaches a student how that machine behaves when production begins. A textbook can describe food processing. A factory exposes the learner to schedules, safety requirements, maintenance problems, quality standards, and the discipline required to produce consistently. This school-to-enterprise connection is intended to narrow three important gaps: the gap between theory and equipment, between training programs and business needs, and between graduation and employment. But perhaps the most revealing evidence of the problem comes from people who had already completed university. Burkina Faso launched a vocational conversion program whose first group included 250 university graduates, 110 of them women. Their training emphasized practical skills in areas including livestock and animal health, agricultural and food processing, maintenance, electricity, metal construction, and digital technology. Think about what that means. These participants were not people who had never received an education. They already possessed university qualifications. Yet the government considered additional practical training necessary to improve their ability to enter productive economic activities. This does not prove that university degrees are useless. Burkina Faso still needs doctors, engineers, researchers, teachers, and highly educated specialists. The lesson is more precise. An academic qualification and a skill that an employer urgently needs are not always the same thing. If graduates leave university while companies struggle to find people who can maintain equipment, process agricultural products, manage livestock systems, or perform specialized technical work, then the problem is not simply a shortage of education. It is a mismatch between education and economic reality. And this may be the most important question behind the entire reform. Should success be measured by how many diplomas a country awards, or by how many people can turn what they learned into useful work, production, and opportunity? At the center of this transformation stands a political idea closely associated with Captain Ibrahim Traore. Education should give young people the ability to do something practical with what they know. The message has sometimes been expressed in simple terms. A Burkinabe child should leave school knowing how to work with his own hands. But that idea should not be mistaken for a rejection of intellectual education or universities. The deeper principle is that knowledge should become capability. A mechanic turns knowledge into a repaired machine. A farmer turns knowledge into a better harvest. A technician keeps a processing line operating. An engineer turns scientific understanding into systems, infrastructure, and technology. That philosophy has increasingly appeared in the structure of Burkina Faso's education policies. In 2024, the government launched a presidential initiative for quality education that included improving educational infrastructure, strengthening teachers and school management, and expanding technical and vocational training. The objective was broader than simply opening more vocational classrooms. It was to reshape the relationship between education and national development. And there is another important side to Traore's vision. While Burkina Faso is expanding practical training, it is also pursuing advanced technical education. Plans for the Faso Institute of Technology include fields such as mechanics, energy, mining, telecommunications, digital technology, cybersecurity, and other high technology disciplines. That tells us this is not simply a choice between a university graduate and a skilled worker. Burkina Faso needs both. It needs the worker who can operate a machine, the technician who can diagnose why it stopped, the engineer who can improve its design, and the entrepreneur who can build a business around what that machine produces. Traore's role is important because political leadership can change priorities, direct resources, and push institutions toward a new objective. But no president can personally create a skilled generation. Teachers must teach, Students must practice, companies must participate, equipment must work, and the economy must eventually provide opportunities for the people being trained. So the real test of Traore's educational philosophy will not be the power of his message. It will be whether Burkina Faso can turn that message into a functioning system capable of transforming knowledge into production. A country does not keep its young people simply by asking them to stay. If a young man sees no realistic paths toward employment, income, or building a family, patriotism alone may not be enough to convince him that his future lies at home. This is where Burkina Faso's education reforms connect with another national challenge, creating reasons for skilled young people to build their lives inside the country. Government officials have directly linked stronger technical and vocational training with reducing youth unemployment and migration. During 2025, more than 10,000 young people reportedly benefited from career guidance or professional internship activities. The direction is clear. Training is supposed to lead beyond the classroom toward experience, employment, and eventually economic independence. But it will be premature to describe this as a complete solution to brain drain. Teaching someone a trade does not guarantee that a good job will appear. The real chain is longer. A young person needs useful skills. Those skills need businesses that value them. Businesses need customers, capital, electricity, equipment, and functioning markets. And the worker ultimately needs an income that allows him to see a future for himself and his family. This helps explain what a new productive generation could actually mean for Burkina Faso. It is not merely a generation of manual laborers. It could include a farmer who understands modern production, a mechanic who keeps agricultural machinery running, a technician operating a food processing line, an entrepreneur turning local crops into marketable products, and an engineer developing technologies needed by domestic industry. Together, these people form something more important than a collection of occupations. They form the human infrastructure of an economy. And that may be where the question of national sovereignty becomes personal. When young Burkinabe can learn useful skills, find meaningful work, create businesses, and support families without believing that opportunity exists only somewhere else, staying becomes an economic choice rather than simply a patriotic appeal. Burkina Faso is trying to build more of those possibilities. But training a productive generation and successfully retaining one are two different achievements. The government may be able to expand vocational education. The harder question is whether the economy can grow fast enough to give that newly skilled generation enough reasons to remain, work, invest, and build at home. 170 transformed schools sounds impressive, but 170 buildings do not automatically become 170 effective vocational schools. This may be the greatest test facing Burkina Faso's educational ambitions. Practical education is expensive because students need more than classrooms. Agricultural training requires land, water, seeds, livestock, tools, and machinery. Mechanical training requires workshops and functioning equipment. Electrical training requires appropriate materials and instructors who understand how to use them safely. Then comes maintenance. Buying a machine is one investment. Keeping that machine operating for years is another. If equipment breaks and schools cannot repair or replace it, a program designed around practical learning can quietly return to teaching practical skills through theory. Teachers present another challenge. Expanding vocational education rapidly means Burkina Faso must find enough competent instructors who understand both their trade and how to teach it. The government has begun changing recruitment rules so experienced people from businesses can become trainers even when they do not follow the traditional academic path. That could help, but implementation will determine the result. Security adds another layer of difficulty. Continued instability can disrupt schools, move families, complicate teacher deployment, discourage investment, and make internships harder to organize. And beyond the school gate stands an even larger economic test. What happens if Burkina Faso successfully trains thousands of technicians, mechanics, processors, and agricultural specialists, but the economy does not create enough productive opportunities for them. The country could replace one problem with another. Instead of graduates holding academic degrees without jobs, it could have skilled vocational graduates still searching for work. That is why factories, reliable electricity, financing, transportation, technology, businesses, and markets matter as much as training. Vocational education is therefore a necessary part of economic transformation, but it is not sufficient by itself. The government's goal of moving towards 60% technical and vocational education extends to 2050. That long horizon matters. Burkina Faso is beginning a structural experiment whose results will take years to judge. The true measure will not be how many schools receive new science, how many machines are purchased, or how ambitious the official target sounds. It will be whether young people leave those schools with useful skills and then find real opportunities to put those skills to work. Any serious discussion of Ibrahim Traore must acknowledge that his government has faced significant international criticism. Human rights organizations have raised concerns about press freedom, political space, security practices, and alleged abuses. Those issues deserve examination on their own evidence. But there is an important distinction that is often lost when Burkina Faso is discussed through a simple confrontation between Traore and the West. There is little credible evidence that Western governments and institutions oppose Burkina Faso's vocational education reforms simply because they could strengthen economic sovereignty. In fact, the picture is considerably more complicated. The European Union itself places substantial importance on vocational education and training. International development institutions have repeatedly identified skill shortages as an obstacle to employment and productivity in Burkina Faso. The World Bank has recommended greater access to technical and vocational education, while international partners have supported projects that combine general education with practical skills. Japan and UNICEF, for example, have supported multipurpose schools where students can encounter fields such as electricity, mechanics, construction, and information technology. So vocational education itself is hardly an idea unique to Traore or something foreign partners automatically reject. This does not mean international criticism of his government should be dismissed, nor does it mean every official claim about the education reform should be accepted without scrutiny. A government can face legitimate criticism over political governance while pursuing an education policy that deserves serious economic evaluation. Both realities can exist at the same time. The correct question, therefore, is not whether someone supports or opposes Ibrahim Traore. The better questions are measurable. Are students actually receiving more practical training? Are the new centers properly equipped? Are internships producing useful experience? Are businesses finding the skills they need? Are graduates finding jobs or creating enterprises? And are incomes and productivity improving? Those answers will matter far more than political slogans from either side. If Burkina Faso wants this reform to become evidence of greater sovereignty, it will eventually have to demonstrate results beyond government announcements. And if outside critics want to evaluate it fairly, the same standard should apply. Judge the policy by what it produces. Because the future of these young people should ultimately be measured not by political narratives, but by whether education gives them genuine opportunities to build productive lives. Burkina Faso is still far from knowing whether this educational transformation will succeed, but the direction raises a question that reaches beyond one country. If a nation possesses land, gold, cotton, corn, tomatoes, livestock, and other resources, yet lacks enough people capable of transforming those resources into higher value products, how much economic sovereignty does it truly possess? That is why this story is larger than vocational schools. Burkina Faso is trying to move from roughly 5% participation in technical and vocational education towards 60% by 2050. It is converting 170 general schools, expanding practical agricultural education, connecting students with businesses, developing hundreds of agricultural occupations, and creating pathways from production to processing. Yet other African nations should not simply copy the 60% targets. Each country must begin with its own economy. What does it produce? What does it import unnecessarily? Which industries could grow locally? Which skills are missing? And what should schools teach so that young people can participate in those industries? For agriculture, the principle is especially powerful. A country needs people who can cultivate crops, repair machinery, preserve harvests, operate processing equipment, manage factories, design technology, and build businesses. Sovereignty over resources becomes much stronger when sovereignty over skills develops beside it. This is where the experiments associated with Ibrahim Traore will ultimately be judged. If the reforms work, his educational legacy may not simply be the number of schools opened or machines purchased. It may be a generation taught to transform knowledge into productive capability. If they fail, ambitious targets will remain numbers on government documents. The same lesson matters across Mali under Assimi Goïta, Niger under Abdurrahmane Tiani, and the wider Sahel and West Africa. It also belongs in larger conversations involving the African Union, France, and anyone following African news about the continent's economic future. Africa does not have to choose between knowledge and practical skills. It needs both. So tell us what you believe. Should education prioritize academic degrees, practical skills, or deliberately combine the two? And follow the channel as we continue examining whether Africa can transform its resources, its knowledge, and above all, its people into lasting prosperity. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos